As a child, I grew up in Texas. And when I tell people that, I usually get this immediate reaction of, oh, Texas. And that's just because that area of the world has a reputation. Now, I didn't grow up in Austin or Dallas or Houston. I grew up in a really small town near Fort Hood, which is a military base in the rural part of Texas. And I had a really nice life as a child. It was an amazing life. We had a nice house. We had a big yard to play in, nice neighbors. I was never wanting for food or toys or anything like that. So I think in a lot of ways, I just had a very normal, typical childhood. It was only when I became an adult and I started comparing notes with others and trying to understand my own experience in relationship to their experiences that I realized there were some experiences I had that weren't quite so normal. One was just wildlife. Now, Texas is kind of like Australia, where there's a lot of animals there that can kill you, and they're pretty well all over the place. Everything from snakes, of course, to tarantulas and scorpions. And I think one of the worst were the fire ants. Those were just ubiquitous and all over the place. And if you stood in one place too long and you were unlucky enough to be standing on an ant mound, they would just crawl up your whole body and bite, 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 bite. But for the most part, I avoided this simply by fact of I'm not an outdoorsy person. So I spent most of my time indoors and most of my time playing video games, which was my hobby of choice as a child. And it's still kind of my hobby of choice. But the other thing that was kind of going on in the background were the communities around me were different than what a lot of other people might experience. So I remember as a child hearing about this cult leader named David Koresh, and there was a siege at one of the compounds of the cult. And I remember hearing about hundreds of people dying in that, and that a lot of them were children. I remember hearing about a mass shooting that happened right near where my dad worked at one of the kind of cafeteria places that served food. And I remember thinking like, oh yeah, those things are bad. That's not a good thing. You don't want this sort of thing in the world. But I don't ever remember thinking that they weren't just part of life, that this wasn't just a kind of normal experience that people have. I just assumed everywhere in the world kind of dealt with very similar situations. And so I never really acknowledged the kind of violence that was surrounding me and the communities around me. So when I was a teenager, my family moved from Texas to Pennsylvania. And after I finished high school, I remember hearing about the Columbine massacre, where a student came into their high school and just shot up their high school. And I remember Michael Moore had made a movie shortly after the massacre to kind of memorialize it in some way. But again, I didn't really think that anything was unusual about this. It was just part of the experience growing up. It was part of my world experience, I guess you could say. I just figured this was the way the world is. And so I moved to Philadelphia, and I was working in North Philly. And this is a place that's, I guess, a fairly high crime area in Philadelphia. At least it was when I was there. And so you heard about, on the news, or you'd hear you'd get a notice at your workplace that says, there's an active shooter in the neighborhood. And so you knew to kind of be aware, be cautious, and kind of always try to kind of avoid certain areas, or what they always said, avoid being a victim, making yourself a victim of a crime, which I always found to be an interesting way of putting things. It wasn't until I moved to Norway that things began to dawn on me that living in a place that's surrounded by violence isn't normal. It's not just a given that our lives have to be like this. Now, I'm not saying that there's not violent crime in Norway. Of course, there is violent crime. I live in Oslo. It's a city. There's almost always going to be violent crime in urban areas. But the experience of violence in Norway is a very different experience than the one I had living in anywhere that I lived in the U.S. And I remember even when I first moved here, this feeling of I can't let myself get too relaxed in this environment, because if I do move back to the United States, then I got to be ready to mentally always be prepared to deal with a violent situation that might occur around me. And so it was really, really strange to move to a city where there's such a low incidence of violence that I don't have to worry necessarily about where I go at night. I don't have to worry about my personal safety or security. And that doesn't mean that there's not times that I feel uncomfortable in the city, but generally speaking, my life or my health and safety aren't at risk. And so it was a really, it took a lot to kind of evolve my thinking that I don't have to be continuously aware of my safety when I'm in the community that I live in. And so I had to relearn a lot of ways of life, a lot of ways of living. Of course, after a few years, I just stopped worrying about it altogether, and now I don't really worry about it at all. I always think about, experiencing violence whenever I take a trip back to the United States, but whenever I'm in Norway, even when I travel in Europe, I generally don't even give it a second thought. So I guess the takeaway here is this: it's easy sometimes to assume that your experience is probably the only way of living, that yours is the reference point, and that everyone else kind of has a similar experience. But I think it's really important to examine our assumptions, examine what we're just taking as default, as, oh, this is an expectation of life, and try to connect with different ways of living and different experiences, because there's a lot of value in that. There's a lot of value in thinking about the world around you in a different way. And you'll find that that the life that you kind of assumed everyone was living isn't necessarily so.